Throughout the rich history of the NBA, there have been many different dominant teams, who each have their own strong argument for the title of the greatest team in NBA history. Today, I'm presenting a massive compilation video for the teams that I believe have the best argument. Sure, you could add 6 or 7 more teams to this list, but like I said, these are the ones that I personally think stand out amongst the crowd. Let me know in the comments who you believe has the best case. So without further ado, let's get into it.
The 1985-86 Boston Celtics. They are universally recognized as one of the greatest teams of NBA history. Although the 80s were defined by super teams and rivalries, the 86 Celtics were never seriously threatened by any opposition that season. They steamrolled the league. Boston's starting five was one of the greatest ever on both ends of the court. The 6'4" Dennis Johnson started at point guard. Beside him was Danny Ainge at the 2-guard spot. Then you had Larry Bird at small forward and Kevin McHale and Robert Parrish down low. Beyond their fantastic starting five was their depth. Leading the bench unit was the 6'11" Bill Walton, who was that year's 6th Man of the Year winner. Then you had guys like Scott Wedman, Jerry Seasting, Rick Carlisle, Sam Vincent, Greg Kite, and David Thirdkill. Looking at the results of this group, we see that the Celtics finished with a league-best 67-15 record. They had the 3rd best defense and the number 1 ranked offense that season. They beat teams by an average of 9.4 points over the course of the season. They dominated the playoffs with a 15-3 record, and they had that season's MVP, Larry Bird. Their head coach was Casey Jones, who often doesn't get enough attention for the success of his team. He took over the Celtics in 1983 and spent 5 years there. In these years, they went to the NBA Finals 4 out of those 5 seasons, and they won the championship twice. He had this team playing hard defense, and the chemistry was off the charts. Larry was basically their verbal player coach and leader. It's often said that groups take on the image of their leader, and in this case, it's very true. If I had to describe them in a word, I would call them unselfish. The ball movement of this team was incredibly beautiful to watch. Whether it was on the fast break or half-court sets, Boston was always looking to make the extra pass. Speaking of their leader, Larry Bird won his 3rd straight MVP that season with averages of 25.8 points, 9.8 rebounds, and 6.8 assists on 49.6% shooting. This was not among Bird's 50-40-90 seasons, but he was incredibly close. Something that people often forget is how Larry was also a very capable defender who made 3 all-defense teams in his career. Their consistent second scoring option Kevin McHale also had a monster season. He was almost always a sure thing whenever he was in the post and had his back to the basket. He had an incredibly high offensive IQ, some of the best footwork in the game, and amazing length with an incredibly high release point on his shot. When McHale was in the post, his teammates often called it the torture chamber due to the fact that he was so difficult to stop. That season, he averaged 21.3 points, 8.1 rebounds, and 2 blocks on 57.4% shooting. McHale was also first team all-defense that year. Speaking of defense, where they really stand out among the all-time great teams is their interior defense. Bird was 6'9", McHale was 6'10", and Parrish was 7'1". It wasn't just their height, but even more so, their length. We don't have a recorded wingspan for Parrish, but it looks like it was at least as long as his 7'1" height. McHale, on the other hand, had a freakish 8-foot-long wingspan. Assuming that estimate is completely accurate, that would give him the 2nd longest wingspan in NBA history. Coming off the bench was another 6'11" big man, Bill Walton, who averaged 1.3 blocks and only 19 minutes played per game. Between Parrish, McHale, and Walton, you have solid rim protection for all 48 minutes of the game. This aspect was crucial to their success in the 1986 NBA Finals. The Houston Rockets were just coming off of beating Magic, Kareem, and Worthy's 62-win Lakers. Houston eliminated Los Angeles in only 5 games. With that being said, basketball is a game of matchups, and as good as the Twin Tower tandem of Ralph Sampson and Hakeem Olajuwon were, you're simply not going to beat the 86 Celtics with size, and Boston handled them in 6 games. One of the less talked about starters from the Celtics was Dennis Johnson. Dennis was the starting point guard, and over time, he's actually become one of the more underrated and overlooked players of NBA history. He was a former Finals MVP winner back when he won the championship as a member of the 1979 Seattle Supersonics. He was averaging 15.6 points this year with the Celtics, but he had got as high as 20 points per game during his career. Johnson's final All-Star appearance was just prior to the 86 season, and he received 5 All-Star selections in total. He was also the Celtics' best perimeter defender, who they relied heavily upon to slow down the great scoring guards in the league those years. He was second team all-defense that season, and in total, DJ received 9 all-defense team selections over the course of his career. He was also known to be a big game performer and had a smooth mid-range jump shot. You could say that their 6'4" shooting guard Danny Ainge was the worst player in their starting 5, but he was certainly far from a bad player. Danny averaged 10.7 points and 5.1 assists through the season, and he was actually very efficient in his contributions as he shot 50% from the field, 36% from three-point range, and 90% from the free throw line. Danny was also incredibly scrappy, he was a big trash talker, and one of the OG floppers of NBA history, which can easily be seen as a negative, but I can tell you as a Lakers fan who watched him play, there were plenty of times where Danny knew how to get under the offensive player's skin and would get the ref to make the crucial calls when they mattered most. It was super frustrating to me, but only because he was good at it. The Celtics were never seriously challenged in that postseason run. Despite a 49 and 63 point performance from Jordan, they swept the Bulls in the first round. After that, they easily handled Dominique and the Hawks in just 5 games. Then they swept Sidney Moncrief and the Bucks in the conference finals. As I mentioned earlier, the Rockets did push them to 6 games in the NBA Finals, but the Celtics got up to an early 3-1 lead, and the series was never really in doubt. What makes the '86 Celtics so dangerous is that they can attack you in so many ways offensively while being so versatile defensively. There isn't another team in NBA history that I could put against the Celtics in a 7-game series where I would feel like the Celtics wouldn't do well against them. On offense, they could run the fast break, but they could also slow it down and run things through the post. They could pick and roll you all day with their bigs. They could punish you from the outside with the all-time great shooting of Larry Bird, or they could simply run the isolation through McHale, which is always a good option. Boston natives know this already, but for the rest of you, it's important that you recognize the 1986 Celtics have a legitimate case for the title of greatest team of all time.
The 1982-83 Philadelphia 76ers. Sandwiched right in the heart of the Lakers and Celtics dynasty days is one of the greatest teams of all time, and a team that some even consider as the best of the best. In the summer of 1982, the 76ers signed the superstar Moses Malone. He was in the prime of his career, coming off of an MVP season with the Houston Rockets. Waiting for him there was the lethal man known as Dr. J, Julius Erving. In 1982, before they had acquired Moses Malone, the 76ers were already considered one of the best teams in the league. They had won 58 games and pushed the Lakers to 6 games in the 1982 NBA Finals. They had come extremely close to winning the championship, and then they simply improved in the offseason by adding the league's MVP. A tandem of Dr. J and Moses is terrifying enough in itself, but they had much more firepower than that. 4 out of their 5 starters were named NBA All-Stars in that 1983 season. Starting at the point was the Hall of Famer Maurice Cheeks. The 6'1", 27-year-old loved the fast break, and he was an excellent facilitator and an excellent defender who made first-team All-Defense that season and a total of 5 All-Defense teams over the course of his career. More specifically, Maurice was one of the greatest pickpockets of NBA history and currently stands 5th on the all-time list in steals. Starting at the 2-guard spot was the efficient scoring shooting guard Andrew Toney. As a 25-year-old, he was in the prime of his career and put up 19.7 points and 4.5 assists on 50% shooting over the course of that season. At the 3 was the 6'7" small forward Julius Erving. He was 32 years old and technically just past his prime seasons, but with that being said, he was still lethal and one of the best wings in the league. That season, he contributed with 21.4 points, 6.8 rebounds, and 3.7 assists on 51.7% shooting. Their weakest spot in the starting lineup was at power forward. The 6'8", 26-year-old rookie Mark Ivoroni contributed just 5 points and 4 rebounds in his 20 minutes per game. But when you're surrounded by all-stars, I can understand why it can be hard to achieve nice numbers. Starting at the 5 was arguably the most underrated center in NBA history, Moses Malone. Moses was once again absolutely dominant that season, both as a scorer and on the boards. He put up ridiculous numbers of 24.5 points, a league-leading 15.3 rebounds, and 2 blocks on 50% shooting. He was also first-team All-Defense that year. Coming off the bench was their go-to 6th man, the 6'9" power forward Bobby Jones. He played 23.6 minutes per game that season, and his nickname was the Secretary of Defense, and for good reason. Bobby was a 5-time All-Star who made 11 All-Defense teams over the course of his career. He was so good defensively that season that Bobby made first-team All-Defense as the 6th man.
Needless to say, he was that year's winner of the Sixth Man of the Year award. Between Malone, Maurice Cheeks, and Bobby Jones, the 76ers represented half of the entire NBA's first-team All-Defenders that year. Rounding out their rotation were additional decent pieces in Clint Richardson and Clement Johnson. With Maurice Cheeks and Irving, they were fierce in transition, but if they wanted to slow things down and run a power offense through Moses, they could do that too. Looking at the results of this group, we see that the 76ers finished with a league-best 65-17 record. They had statistically the 5th best defense and the 5th best offense that season. They beat teams by an average of 7.7 points over the season. They utterly dominated the playoffs, finishing the postseason with a 12-1 record, and they had that season's MVP, Moses Malone. Moses is still the only player in NBA history to win back-to-back MVP awards on 2 separate teams. This team was absolutely incredible and was clearly the best throughout the season, and they knew it too. Heading into that postseason, a reporter asked Moses how he expected his 76ers to do in the playoffs, and his response was, foe, meaning the amount of games they would play in each series. To say their confidence was high would be a massive understatement. A big factor of why the 76er team is so unbelievably great is because of the strength of their playoff schedule and how they dominated regardless of the competition. They started by sweeping a solid New York Knicks team in only 4 games. After that, in the Eastern Conference Finals, they had a meeting with the powerhouse Milwaukee Bucks, who had names like Sidney Moncrief, Marcus Johnson, and Bob Lanier. If that doesn't tell you how strong the Bucks were, consider the fact that this Milwaukee team was coming off of a 4-game sweep over the Bird, McHale, and Parrish-led Boston Celtics. Up to that point, the Celtics had never been swept in their 30-year playoff history. Despite the Bucks looking like a more than formidable matchup, Moses and the 76ers still dominated, defeating Milwaukee in only 5 games. Waiting for them in the finals was the defending champions and the team that beat them last year, the Magic Johnson and Kareem-led Los Angeles Lakers. The Lakers seemed poised to be the resistance that the 76ers needed, but the truth is, absolutely no one was slowing down the 1983 76ers. In those finals, Malone absolutely destroyed Kareem and the Lakers, putting up 25.8 points, 18 rebounds, and 1.5 steals and 1.5 blocks on 50.7% shooting, and he was rewarded the Finals MVP as they stunned the basketball world by sweeping the juggernaut Lakers. That 12-1 postseason run is still to this day tied for the fewest losses in NBA playoff history. This would be their only championship in the 80s as Julius was beginning to reach the twilight of his career. But as far as that single season, all the perfect elements collided to make the perfect storm, and the result was a team with a strong case for the title of greatest in NBA history. The 2000 to 2001 Los Angeles Lakers, famously known for one of the most dominant postseason runs in sports history, led by one of the most dominant duos ever, a 29-year-old Shaquille O'Neal and a 22-year-old Kobe Bryant. This was the closest thing we ever saw to a prime Shaq and a prime Kobe on the same team. This was the biggest moment of overlap of the greatness of both players. Shaq was still at the height of his powers as Kobe was experiencing his breakout season as one of the NBA's leading scorers while continuing to be an elite defender. Additionally, this Lakers roster was arguably their deepest of any of their modern championship runs. More often than not, starting at the point guard position was the experienced veteran Ron Harper. He shot about 47% and chipped in just 7 points a game, but his experience and reliable defensive abilities often go overlooked. The Lakers didn't have a star point guard, but people often forget how deep they were at that position because backing up Harper was Derek Fisher and Brian Shaw. Fisher was 26 years old, and although Harper started more games, Derek chipped in with numbers of 11.5 points, 4.4 assists, and 2 steals on 41% shooting. Whenever the defense would collapse on Shaq, which was basically all the time, Fisher was one of those solid options for him to kick the ball out to, as Derek shot 40% from 3-point range over the course of the regular season and shot a ridiculous 51.5% from 3-point range during the playoffs. Fisher was one of those guys who did all the little things well, whether it be hustle for the loose ball, take a charge at a crucial moment of the game, or automatically knock down free throws from Rasheed Wallace's technical fouls. Fish was the kind of role player that any team would want when the games mattered most. Brian Shaw was a large 6'6" point guard / shooting guard. Sometimes he would back up Harper and Fish, but he would also come off the bench for Kobe as well. Shaw was another reliable option for Shaq to kick the ball out to, as he too upped his game in the playoffs, going from 31% 3-point shooting in the regular season to 35% in the postseason. Shaw was also one of the best lob passers in the entire league. Kobe would sometimes be on the receiving end, but he was more known for his connections with Shaq. The alley-oop pass from Shaw to Shaq was coined the Shaw-Shaq Redemption, in reference to the movie The Shawshank Redemption, which is an all-time great movie, by the way. Kobe obviously started at the two-guard spot, and this was the beginning of him torching the league. He had improved his scoring average by 6 points from the previous season, as he averaged 28.5 points, 5.9 rebounds, and 5 assists on 46.4% shooting. He was also second-team All-Defense that year. Starting at the small forward position was the 6'7", 31-year-old Rick Fox. He was a solid contributor, putting in about 10 points, 4 rebounds, and 3 assists over the course of the season. Forgive me if I'm starting to sound repetitive at this point, but Fox was yet another reliable three-point shooter for the ball to be kicked out to, as he shot 39.3% from that distance. Starting at the power forward was the Lakers' big acquisition in the offseason, the 6'10" Horace Grant. Horace was 35 years old at this point, so he wasn't what he once was with the Bulls and Magic, but he still chipped in with about 8.5 points and 7 rebounds a game. He also helped Shaq significantly with the interior defense, which was huge, considering how strong the power forward position was in the Western Conference at that time. Everyone knows about the guy starting at center, the 7'1", 325-pound Shaquille O'Neal, the most dominant big man since Wilt Chamberlain. Shaq was coming off of his near-unanimous MVP season with almost identical numbers of 28.7 points, 12.7 rebounds, 3.7 assists, and 2.8 blocks on 57% shooting. There's not much that I could tell you about the Diesel that you don't already know, but simply put, in many ways, Shaq defined that era, especially in the Western Conference. All of the contending teams were focused on acquiring big bodies to throw at Shaq in order to challenge his physicality, and yet regardless, Shaq still dominated playing bully ball. Filling out the roster was the 6'9" power forward, who was one of the most clutch role players the game has ever seen, Robert Horry. And then you had Devin George, Tyronn Lue, Isaiah Ryder, Slava Medvedenko, and simply the greatest dancer of all time, Mark Madsen. Looking at the results of this group, we see that the Lakers finished with a 56-26 record, which was the second best in the league. They had the 21st ranked defense and the number 2 ranked offense that season. They beat teams by an average of 3.4 points over the course of the regular season. They historically dominated in the playoffs with a 15-1 record, although they did not have that season's MVP, who was Allen Iverson. A few of these things are the reasons the 2001 Lakers don't get more credit in the case for the GOAT team title, because a 56-26 record is significantly worse than most GOAT team candidates. Plus, their defense was in the bottom half of the league, and they weren't typically blowing teams out either, as their margin of victory was relatively pretty low. For example, the '86 Celtics, who I've already done a video on, had a margin of victory that was nearly 3 times that of the '01 Lakers. But to completely disregard the Lakers for these reasons could be something that's lacking a bit of context. The 2001 Lakers were coming off of a season where they had just won the championship. Watching most of that regular season, they often seemed complacent, and it appeared as if they were simply cruising through the regular season before they eventually turned up the intensity just in time for the playoffs. And man, did they turn it up. The Lakers won the final 8 games of the regular season heading into the playoffs. Combine that with their 15-1 postseason record, and the Lakers finished the most difficult time of the year, winning 23 out of 24 games. What was incredible about this team wasn't just the fact that they went 15-1 in the playoffs, but it was who they beat to go 15-1. This was at a time when the Western Conference was stacked with talent and powerful teams. They started their postseason run up against the 50-win Portland Trail Blazers, the same team that had pushed them to 7 games in the Western Conference Finals the previous season. They destroyed the Blazers, sweeping them in 3 games with an average margin of victory of 14.7 points. The second round was against their rival, the loaded 55-win Sacramento Kings. Well, despite the hype, the Lakers swept them too, winning by an average of 9.2 points. Shaq and Kobe's imprints were all over this series, as Shaq dropped 44 points and 21 rebounds in Game 1, and then 43 points and 20 rebounds in Game 2. Then it was Kobe's turn, as he dropped 36, 7, and 7 in Game 3, and 48 points and 16 rebounds in Game 4. Surely the San Antonio Spurs would give a greater challenge. This San Antonio squad was led by Tim Duncan, David Robinson, and Derek Anderson. They had finished the regular season with a 58-24 record, which was the best record in the entire league, even greater than the Lakers. On top of that, San Antonio had the best defense in the league as well. The Lakers were not supposed to sweep this team, but not only did they do that, but they absolutely demolished them with an average margin of victory of a whopping 22.2 points. Kobe was leading the way, averaging 33, 7, and 7 on 51% shooting. Iverson's iconic 48-point performance was good enough to steal Game 1 of the NBA Finals, but after that, it was business as usual for the Lakers, and this time it was Shaq leading the way, putting up 33 points and 16 rebounds on 57% shooting over the course of the finals. These were the averages of Shaq and Kobe over the course of the entire playoffs. You can argue who was Batman and who was Robin over these playoffs, but whoever was Robin probably put up the greatest playoff performance from a Robin in NBA history. After the season was over, everyone in the media was comparing this team to the '96 Bulls. Over time, people haven't made that comparison as much, since I think a lot of people have forgotten the context that shows just how great this team was. Ultimately, this Lakers squad had it all. 2 all-time great alphas, a collection of shooters who are surrounding stars that demand so much of the defensive attention, clutch performers with championship-level experience all over the roster, and arguably the greatest coach in NBA history. This Lakers unit would likely challenge any other all-time great team. When I say the 1989 Detroit Pistons, what are some of the words about them that come to mind? Intense, physical, violent, the bad boys? Those are some common choices. But what about deepest team in NBA history? What about greatest team of all time? Despite the unpopularity of those statements, there's actually more merit to it than most people realize. As much as me and my dad hated the Pistons in years past for, in my opinion, their overly physical and instigating nature, we've also never failed to recognize how talented, skilled, and simply good that team really was. One of the best collections of talent the league has ever seen. Leading the team at the point guard spot was one of the greatest ever at that position, the dazzling 27-year-old Isaiah Thomas. Isaiah was one of the greatest dual threats of all time, as he could beat you in multiple ways, whether it was as a scorer or as a distributor. You had to respect both aspects of his game, and he was incredibly difficult to keep up with, as he was also one of the greatest ball handlers of all time. Before Kyrie Irving and Allen Iverson were impressing audiences and confusing defenders with their incredible handles, that was Isaiah Thomas's thing. On the season, Isaiah averaged 18.2 points, 8.3 assists, and 1.7 steals on 46.4% shooting. These numbers were nice, but they were actually a little bit below his usual standards, and a big part of that was the fact that less was required of him this year, as Detroit was loaded with so many offensive weapons this season. Joining Isaiah in the backcourt was the 6'3", 25-year-old Joe Dumars. Joe, over time, has become one of the more overlooked all-stars of NBA history. He was just beginning the prime of his career and put up averages of 17.2 points, 5.7 assists, and 2.5 rebounds on 50.5% shooting. Beyond his solid efficiency from the field as a guard, he also shot 85% from the free throw line and 48% from three-point range. He didn't shoot many three-pointers, but when he did, he made it basically half of the time. Joe was one of the best perimeter defenders in the entire NBA, as he made first-team All-Defense this season and would go on to make 5 All-Defense teams in total. His defensive prowess was incredibly crucial to their success, considering the fact that he would often be the one guarding guys like Michael Jordan, Clyde Drexler, Reggie Miller, and Dennis Johnson. On top of all of this, he would save his signature performance for that year's NBA Finals, which we'll get into more later. Starting the season at the small forward position was the 33-year-old legendary scorer Adrian Dantley. He was productive for about half of the season, but after butting heads with the team leader Isaiah Thomas for some time, Dantley was traded for another star and a great scorer as well, the 6'6", 29-year-old Mark Aguirre. Mark had averaged 25 points per game in the 7 years with Dallas before he joined the Pistons, and although he was capable of continuing to put up superstar numbers, less was required of him on the super team Pistons. In the second half of that year with Detroit, Aguirre averaged 15.5 points and 4.2 rebounds on 48% shooting. Starting at the power forward spot was the team's enforcer, the 6'10" Rick Mahorn. From a scoring standpoint, he was certainly the least talented player in the Pistons starting 5. With that being said, he still had plenty to offer. He was one of the toughest and most physically punishing players in the entire league, and a solid defender as well. If a wing managed to get past his defender and attack the rim, there was a good chance Mahorn was the guy who was meeting him there and making him pay for it. The starting center was the infamous Bill Laimbeer, who I've said in a previous video is my choice for the dirtiest player in NBA history. From a quote from the legendary Larry Bird, he said Rick Mahorn would try to hit you on defense, but Bill Laimbeer would try to hurt you. The flagrant foul did not exist in the NBA until the 1990 season, meaning that up to that point, Laimbeer would get his money's worth for every foul he committed on the offensive player.
Due to this, seeing Laimbeer in the middle of an all-out brawl was quite a common occurrence. With that being said, the physical nature of the 6'10 center is what he's known and remembered for, but beyond that, he's actually got a lot of skills on the court. He was one of the elite rebounders in the game, and a former rebounding champion. Along with that, he was a pretty good three-point shooter and a solid stretch 5 option before it became popular in the NBA. With this skill set, Laimbeer would often successfully run the pick and roll and the pick and pop with Isaiah Thomas. On the season, he averaged 13.7 points, 9.6 rebounds, and 1.2 blocks on 50% shooting, 35% from three-point range, and 84% from the free throw line, making him a rare and extremely efficient NBA center. The starting unit was scary enough as it is, but coming off the bench were two men who were both worthy of being a 6th man of the year. The first was a man we know very well, the 27-year-old tenacious Dennis Rodman. In only 27 minutes per game, he averaged 9 points and 9.7 rebounds. He didn't shoot the ball much, but when he did, he made nearly 60% of his shots. His greatest attribute at the time was without question his defense. He had incredible stamina and was very quick, and would frequently make the offensive player uncomfortable. Despite the fact that he was coming off the bench, Rodman still made first-team All-Defense that season. That should tell you how good he was. The second guy off the bench was known as the Microwave, the 6'2" Vinnie Johnson. Vinnie got that nickname because he was known to heat up quickly and score plenty of buckets in sudden spurts, which made him a terrific spark off the bench. That season, he put up 13.8 points, 3.1 assists, and 3 rebounds on 46% shooting in only 25 minutes per game. Rounding out the rotation were solid pieces like James Edwards and John Salley. When we look at the talent on this squad from top to bottom, you can see why I think they have a strong case for the deepest team in NBA history. They were led by the Hall of Fame head coach and basketball genius Chuck Daly, who famously earned his spot as the head coach of the Dream Team. Chuck displayed as a leader what the Pistons were all about, as he embodied their passion and intensity in his fiery coaching style. Although this unit was poised to win their first championship in the '89 season, it's worth quickly noting that had it not been for a highly controversial foul call in Game 6 of the '88 finals, known as the Phantom Foul, then these Pistons may have been entering the '89 season as the defending champions. But that's for another video, so let's continue. Looking at the results of this group over the 1989 season, we see that the Pistons finished with a league-best 63-19 record. They statistically had the 3rd best defense and the number 7th ranked offense that season. They beat teams by an average of 5.8 points over the season. They dominated the playoffs with a 15-2 record, although they did not have that season's MVP, who was Magic Johnson. This Detroit team played an unselfish style of basketball where everyone contributed and made the extra pass. They had 5 players who averaged double-digit scoring, and defensively, they worked as a unit as well. What really makes this team stand out wasn't just their unique style and intensity, it wasn't just their level of talent on paper or their unity as a group, but in large part, it was because of how they dominated the postseason and who they dominated. They swept the Kevin McHale and Robert Parrish-led Boston Celtics in the first round. Then in the semifinals, they swept the Ricky Pierce and Sidney Moncrief-led Milwaukee Bucks. In the Eastern Conference Finals, they beat Jordan, Pippen, and the Chicago Bulls in 6 games. Waiting for them in the NBA Finals was the team that defeated them last year, the defending champion Los Angeles Lakers, who were actually seeking their 3rd straight title, led by the MVP, Magic Johnson. The Lakers had also gone a perfect 11-0 through the Western Conference playoffs, so at the very least, another long, hard-fought series was expected between these two juggernauts. But that didn't happen. Joe Dumars led the way as they convincingly swept the Lakers in 4 games to secure their first ever NBA championship, which many people think should have come 1 year earlier. Dumars was the finals MVP, putting up numbers of 27.3 points and 6 assists on 57.6% shooting. It is important to note that Magic Johnson did injure his hamstring in the 3rd quarter of Game 2, so the Lakers might have posed a greater threat if that had not occurred. Regardless, this was an all-time great team that would go on to win the title again the following year. Detroit had the players, skill sets, and talent to be an elite team in any era under any rules of basketball. But if you play by their rules, you're going to be hard-pressed to find any team who could beat the 1989 Detroit Pistons. The 1971-72 Los Angeles Lakers. The Lakers organization has a long, rich history of success and have had several teams with a worthy argument for the title of greatest team of all time. As good as the Shaq and Kobe Lakers were, and the Showtime Lakers of the 80s, there's a strong likelihood that the first Los Angeles championship team might have been the greatest of them all.
To start the season, the Lakers had the 6'3" Jerry West starting at point guard, the 6'1" and underrated Gil Goodrich was starting at shooting guard, Elgin Baylor was at the 3 spot, the 6'7" Happy Hairston was at the 4, and the dominant Wilt Chamberlain was starting at center. Rounding out the roster was guys like Jim McMillan, Keith Erickson, Flynn Robinson, Leroy Ellis, Pat Riley, John Trapp, and Jim Clemens. Heading into this season, this team was not expected to be as good as they would be. In the past few years, they had come close to winning the NBA championship multiple times, but they couldn't get it done. They had been dealing with numerous injuries, and on top of that, their best players seemed as if they were past their glory days, as Jerry West was 33, Wilt Chamberlain was 35, and Elgin Baylor was 37 years old. On top of all of this, they were entering this season with their third coach in only 4 years. It appeared as if their championship window had completely shut. But the new coach would soon change that perception. Bill Sharman was a former Boston Celtic who several of the Lakers players competed against while he played in the NBA. Sharman's emphasis on team play and fast break basketball would do wonders for this group. He came in with high expectations and a fierce work ethic and quickly changed the culture for the Lakers. Many of the Lakers players said that those preseason workouts were the toughest workouts they've ever been a part of. He had the team in great shape and the focus continued to be on transition basketball. At this point, Wilt Chamberlain's days of averaging 50 points were well behind him, and instead, Sharman had Wilt focusing more on a team game, which ended up fitting perfectly with this new Lakers offense. In years past, typically teams with Wilt Chamberlain didn't run the fast break much because although Wilt would secure the rebound, his teammates would wait for him to get up the court so they could feed him the ball down low, since he was the focal point of their offense. But now, Wilt was used to get the fast break started with his amazing rebounding and his elite outlet passing, as he then relied offensively on his other Laker weapons. Along with those key aspects of his contributing was Wilt's all-time great rim protection. Wilt stood 7 foot 1 inches tall and had a 7 foot 8 inch wingspan, which he used to its fullness all season long to shut down the opposing teams in the paint. On the season, Wilt averaged 14.8 points, 19.2 rebounds, and 4 assists on 65% shooting. Unfortunately, blocked shots were not tracked until a later date, but I'm sure Wilt would have averaged a ton of them. For this new offense, Sharman wanted Jerry West to play more as the floor general and be the team's main facilitator. It translated to West averaging a career high and leading the league with 9.7 assists per game that season. He also averaged 25.8 points and 4.2 rebounds on 47.7% shooting. Despite all the scoring from West, he was actually not the team's leading scorer that season. That honor went to the underrated legend I mentioned earlier, their starting shooting guard Gil Goodrich. This was Gil's breakout season as he was the main beneficiary of West's new role as a distributor in transition. Gil played all 82 games that season and averaged 25.9 points, 4.5 assists, and 3.6 rebounds on 48.7% shooting. Despite a solid game plan and coaching scheme, after 9 games into the regular season, the Lakers were off to a bumpy 6-3 start, as they hadn't quite played the fast-paced transition basketball that Sharman had envisioned. A major part of that was Elgin Baylor's age and his deteriorating knees. He couldn't quite keep up with the quickness of the rest of the Lakers' offense. Sharman approached Baylor about a reduced role where he could come off the bench and allow younger players to get his starting minutes. But instead, Baylor recognized this as a sign that he couldn't play the game as well as he wanted to, and decided to retire on the spot just 9 games into the season. Losing one of the greatest players the game has ever seen might initially seem like a detriment to the team, but it was actually quite the opposite, on a historic level. Replacing Baylor at the starting small forward position was the 6'5", 23-year-old Jim McMillan, who with his coast-to-coast scoring abilities was more than happy to help push the tempo of the Lakers' offense. He also revealed himself to be a reliable wing defender. Now with the perfect nucleus to execute the game plan as intended, the Lakers weren't just rolling, they were steamrolling the competition. Immediately after the departure of Baylor, the Lakers went on their legendary winning streak. The previous record for the most consecutive wins was at 20 games, and the Lakers would make that streak look laughable. Los Angeles went through the entire months of November and December without losing a single game. They set the new NBA record at 33 straight wins, an astonishing feat that still stands to this day. Their streak was snapped by Kareem, Oscar Robertson, and the defending champion Milwaukee Bucks, keeping the suspense that Milwaukee still might eliminate the Lakers once again in the playoffs. The Lakers continued their dominance throughout the regular season and were hitting their stride again just in time for the playoffs. Just a week before the postseason was set to begin, they defeated the 51-win Warriors by a ridiculous 63 points. They finished the regular season with a 69-13 record, which was an NBA record for a couple decades afterwards. Into the playoffs now, and they came out of the gate strong, sweeping the 57-win Chicago Bulls in 4 games, and it was the Laker backcourt that led the way, as Goodrich and West each averaged an efficient 28.5 points per game. The next series was a matchup with the 63-win and defending champion Milwaukee Bucks. Despite the star power and championship experience on that Bucks squad, the Lakers group was still ultimately too much, as they beat the Bucks in 6 games. The NBA Finals was more of the same, as they comfortably beat the New York Knicks in only 5 games. Goodrich led the team in scoring that series with 25.6 points, but it was Wilt Chamberlain who took home the Finals MVP, putting up 19.4 points and 23.2 rebounds on 60% shooting. Looking at the results of this group over the 1972 season, we see that the Lakers finished with a record-setting 69-13 record. They statistically had the second best defense and easily had the best offense overall that season. They beat teams by an incredible average of 12.3 points per game over the course of the season, which is easily the best margin of victory of all the teams in the GOAT series so far. They dominated the playoffs with a 12-3 record, although they did not have that season's MVP, who was Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. To say the Lakers simply dominated the rest of the league this season would be a significant understatement. Along with their record win streak and their record win total, they also led the league in points, rebounds, and assists, and they scored at least 100 points in 81 out of the 82 regular season games. The 72 Lakers were the perfect storm of talent, experience, coaching, and chemistry that led them to have a legitimate case for the title of greatest team of all time.
The 2016-17 Warriors, who have an incredibly strong case for the title of greatest team in NBA history. More often than not, they felt simply unfair. They were coming off of a 2016 campaign where they had the greatest regular season of all time at a record of 73-9 that ended with an incredible disappointment, losing Game 7 of the NBA Finals in its last moments. They simply improved in the offseason by replacing their small forward who shot a repulsive 34% in the playoffs with a former MVP winner in the prime of his career. The championship was theirs the day they signed Kevin Durant. I even said so on Facebook the day of. I'm not looking for kudos here, I'm just pointing out that it was that obvious. Part of the recruitment pitch to Kevin Durant came from the great Jerry West, who told Kevin, "Imagine all of the open looks you'll get if you sign with us." Jerry was correct. It was a luxury for Kevin Durant to play alongside of 2 of the greatest shooters of all time, Steph Curry and Klay Thompson. Due to this, Durant's 2017 campaign easily became the most efficient season from the field of his career. But enough about just the addition of Durant. Let's get into the roster as a whole. Starting at the point guard position was the defending unanimous MVP Steph Curry, whose numbers took a slight dip when having to share the load with the newly acquired Kevin Durant. But Steph still averaged 25.3 points, 6.6 assists, and 4.5 rebounds on 46.8% shooting. He also shot 41.1% from 3 on a league-leading 10 3-point attempts per game. You know what you're getting from Steph, the league's greatest shooter with limitless range, who's incredibly difficult to defend considering how much he moves and plays without the basketball. The way he demands constant attention and spaces the defense naturally makes the offense easier for everyone on his team, including Klay Thompson, who was the starting shooting guard and who also shot 41% from 3-point range. As many of you know, it wasn't just Klay's ability to shoot that made him stand out, but he was also a terrific on-ball defender. As the ultimate 3-and-D type of guy, Klay had an excellent season with career-high scoring numbers of 22.3 points, 3.7 rebounds, and 2.1 assists on 46.8% shooting. Kevin Durant was at the small forward position and made one of the most seamless transitions a superstar has ever made into a new offense. The 7-foot sniper put up his usual fantastic numbers of 25, 8, and 5 on 53.7% shooting. Although he started at the small forward position, thanks to his length and defensive IQ, the Warriors were actually able to move him to the power forward position when using what they called their death lineup. Durant's interior defense was a major part of why the small ball approach was able to work so well, as he averaged a career high in blocks up to that point at 1.6 per game. KD provided all of this on a personal career low of 33.4 minutes per game. He was able to play so few minutes and reserve himself for the playoffs largely because of how the Warriors were simply blowing teams out with their overwhelming talent, and as a result, he often didn't have to play much of the fourth quarter. Assisting him defensively was their starting power forward and their center in the death lineup, Draymond Green. Draymond's usual contributions were seen on pretty much every area on the stat sheet, as he was widely seen as the team's anchor on both the offensive and defensive end of the court. On offense, he worked as one of the team's main facilitators and actually led all of the Warriors in assists. On defense, he was an absolute dog, harassing the opposing team, leading the league in steals, he was top 15 in blocks, and he was that season's Defensive Player of the Year. At one point, Draymond actually became the first player in NBA history to get a triple-double without scoring 10 points, when he had 11 rebounds, 10 assists, and 10 steals against the Memphis Grizzlies. Starting at the center position was the 6'11 Zaza Pachulia, who wasn't anything too special, but he was a big who could set screens, make the extra pass, and fit within the team's unselfish offense. With that being said, regardless of the fact that he was the starter, Zaza still played in only 18.1 minutes per game, and that in large part was because of their death lineup, which instead featured more of Andre Iguodala, who was a solid wing with experience, who could help facilitate, and was a reliable wing defender down the stretch of games. Contributing off the bench were decent pieces like Ian Clark, Sean Livingston, David West, and JaVale McGee. There was no shortage of ways that this group could attack you. They could suffocate you defensively, they could shoot the lights out from deep, they could punish you in the mid-range, they could push the tempo, they could execute in half-court sets, they could lose you with their incredible ball movement, and they could beat you with isolation plays. It's almost as if no game plan could work against this unit. Looking at the results of this group over the 2017 season, we see that the Warriors finished with a league-best 67-15 record. They statistically had the second-best defense and had easily the best offense overall that season. They beat teams by an incredible average of 11.6 points over the course of the regular season, which is the fourth highest margin of victory in NBA history. They absolutely dominated the playoffs with a record-setting 16-1 record, although they did not have that season's MVP, who was Russell Westbrook. This Warriors unit did absolutely everything well, and when I say everything, I mean literally everything on the court. They were obviously assassins from three-point distance throughout the season, including one performance where 4 different players hit at least 4 three-point shots, making them the first team to ever achieve that feat. They had incredible ball movement and frequently made the extra pass, as they averaged 30.4 assists in the regular season, which was the 5th highest in NBA history. In the playoffs, Golden State had 7 games where they had at least 30 assists as a team. The rest of the playoff teams combined could only match the Warriors' 7 games with at least 30 assists. Not only were they playing a team-oriented style of basketball, but it was smart and clean basketball as well. In franchise history, the fewest turnovers in an NBA playoff game was just 7 turnovers. The Warriors not only tied that record, but they did it 3 separate times in this postseason alone. In the regular season, they beat teams by at least 40 points on 3 separate occasions, which is tied for the most in league history. Embarrassing the opponent was a constant for this group, even throughout the playoffs. They swept the Portland Trail Blazers in the first round, they swept the Utah Jazz in the second round, and they swept the San Antonio Spurs in the Western Conference Finals. Throughout the West playoffs, they beat teams by an average of 16.3 points, which is the greatest deficit of all time. In the NBA Finals against LeBron and the Cavaliers, they continued to handle their business. They went up 3-0 in the series before finally losing their first game in their postseason run. Their 15 straight playoff victories is once again the most in NBA history. There's no other way to say it. The amount of records that this team broke in just one season is absolutely astonishing. If I'm being honest, in a way, I think this team has been taken for granted. Yes, Kevin Durant made a free agency decision that many people viewed as weak and tons of basketball fans didn't appreciate. And I also recall that throughout the postseason, they dominated to such an extent that most fans in the NBA community were calling those playoffs boring. And because of these aspects, I don't think the 2017 Warriors are remembered as fondly as many other great teams of years past. But even if there is some truth to that, being completely objective, you can't deny the fact that the 2017 Warriors provided some of the most quality, beautiful, and excellent basketball ever displayed on the court. The 2012 to 2013 Miami Heat, the championship apex of the Big Three super team. It's easy to simply remember this team for the dominance of their 3 stars, but in this season especially, they were so much more than just that. They had depth,
shooting, a great coach, and a defensive mindset that made them difficult on both ends of the court. Starting at the point guard position was the 6'2" Mario Chalmers. He certainly wasn't one of the stars that made this group a super team, but he was a key piece nonetheless, as he put up over 8 points, 3 assists, and 1.5 steals on 43% shooting in 26 minutes per game. He was also one of their reliable floor spreaders, as he had a career year shooting 40.9% from three-point range. At the shooting guard spot was the dynamic Dwayne Wade, who wasn't quite in his prime anymore, but was still one of the best at his position, as he averaged about 21, 5, 5, and 2 steals on 52.1% shooting. Wade, as usual, was elite on both sides of the basketball, as he was well above league average in steals and blocks among guards. Starting at small forward was arguably the greatest version of LeBron James we've ever seen in an obvious MVP campaign. At this point in his career, he had the perfect blend of experience, maturation, athleticism, and confidence, as he was now the clear leader of this team. This was also a career year on the defensive end of the floor, as he finished second overall in the Defensive Player of the Year race, and many think he should have won the award this year over the Grizzlies' Marc Gasol. LeBron put up his typical stat line of 26.8 points, 8 rebounds, 7.3 assists, and 1.7 steals on an unbelievable 56.5% shooting. That level of efficiency from the field is impressive for a center, but for a small forward, it's basically unheard of. This was also the best year of his career from three-point range, as he shot an elite 40.6% from that distance. It was an all-time great season in terms of superstar efficiency. At one point, LeBron had 6 straight games where he scored at least 30 points while shooting at least 60% from the field. That's the longest streak in NBA history. Quality shot selection and efficiency wasn't just a trait from LeBron this season, but it pretty much summed up the team as a whole, and all 3 of their superstars had their best or their second best season in terms of efficiency. That's one of the luxuries of playing alongside of other superstars. You get much cleaner looks. Starting at power forward was the 6'8" Udonis Haslem, who certainly wasn't putting up monstrous stats, but he did provide toughness and veteran leadership. As I mentioned earlier, this Heat team was very deep, and with Haslem's 19 minutes per game, he was typically one of the first guys to head to the bench. More on the bench unit in a moment. But starting at center was the 6'11" Chris Bosh, who tended to be in the shadow of LeBron and Wade, but his contribution was vital to their success, as he put up 16.6 points, 6.8 rebounds, and 1.4 blocks on a career-best 53.5% from the field. One of the first players to come off the bench was the 37-year-old Ray Allen, who was enjoying his first season with Miami. Even in his old age, he was still one of the greatest threats among role players, as he led everyone outside of the Big Three in scoring, with numbers of 10.9 points, 2.7 assists, and 1.7 rebounds on 41.9% shooting. He was doing his usual thing from three-point range, as he shot 41.9% from that distance. Believe it or not, he actually wasn't the team's best three-point shooter throughout the regular season though. That honor would go to the 6'8" small forward Shane Battier, who averaged about the same amount of minutes as Allen, but also shot more three-point attempts on 43% from three-point range. Rounding out the roster were quality pieces like Norris Cole, Chris Birdman Anderson, Mike Miller, and Rashard Lewis. With a multitude of quality wings on this team, the 2013 Miami Heat became famous for using what they called positionless basketball, where they would use an unorthodox group of players, which traditionally might not seem like a very successful method, but they were quick to prove that wrong, and in a major way. During one large stretch of the season, the team got so hot that they went on an absolutely historic winning streak, as everyone was hitting on all cylinders. Miami won 27 straight regular season games, which is the second longest streak of all time, behind the 1972 Lakers, who won 33 straight, and who we covered earlier in this series. To put 27 straight games in perspective, that means Miami went from February 3rd to March 26th without losing a single game. One strong advantage about this team that's worth mentioning is how their core was relatively young, and overall they had great stamina and endurance. One good way to measure that is how well the team does on the second night of back-to-backs, and this team was literally the greatest ever in that area. Throughout the regular season, on the second night of back-to-backs, they had a record of 15-1, which is tied for the best record in NBA history. When we look back on the glory days of this team, it's easy to simply look at the slashers in Dwayne Wade and LeBron James, but collectively, they were absolutely dangerous from the perimeter, as the Heat had 5 guys who shot at least 3 three-point attempts per game while shooting at least 40% from that distance, which was LeBron, Mario Chalmers, Ray Allen, Shane Battier, and Mike Miller. Looking at the results of this group over the 2013 season, we see that the Heat finished with a league-best 66-win season. They statistically had the 9th best defense and the 2nd best offense overall that season. They beat teams by an average of 7.8 points over the course of the year. They went through the playoffs with a 16-7 record on their way to the championship, and they had that season's MVP, who was LeBron James. Through the East playoffs, they swept the Milwaukee Bucks in the first round, comfortably dismantled the Bulls in the second round, and then eliminated the Pacers in the East Finals in 7 games. The NBA Finals were an absolute classic, which included maybe the most clutch shot in basketball history when Ray Allen did what he was brought on to do and hit a big three to extend the series, before Miami eventually won in the 7th game. If San Antonio had won, then their 2013 squad may have been in the series as well, but ultimately Miami came out on top and solidified their place among the great teams of basketball lore. If you're looking for a GOAT team candidate with young, athletic star power, positionless basketball, an array of shooters, a defensive-minded team, and one of the greatest players of all time at the very height of his powers, then the 2013 Heat may be the team you're looking for, as they have a somewhat underrated case for the title of greatest team in NBA history. The 95-96 Chicago Bulls, recognized by many, maybe most, as the greatest team in NBA history. But once you break it all down, just how strong is their case? As many of you already know, the Bulls were coming off of a disappointing second-round elimination to the Orlando Magic. As a result, motivation was certainly not a trait the 96 Bulls were lacking. The major adjustment heading into the season after the elimination was the addition of the Worm, Dennis Rodman. The Bulls acquiring Dennis definitely wasn't universally seen as a wise move, as Rodman already seemed as if he was at the end of his rope after a dramatic stint with the Spurs, and some analysts felt like Dennis could be the piece that destroys the Bulls organization from the inside. But if there was ever a man fit to handle this challenge, it was the psychological genius, Phil Jackson. Jackson has been praised over the years for his brilliance in terms of basketball X's and O's, but what makes him stand out in my mind is how he controls and influences players' emotions, the way he can manage egos and build a culture, even amidst a tumultuous storm of conflict and tension throughout the entire organization. So let's get into the roster he would be leading. Starting at the point guard position was the 6'6" Ron Harper. The 32-year-old guard used to be a star in his own right, as he averaged over 20 points per game in his days with the Clippers before joining the Bulls. When people reflect on the Bulls' great defense, of course, they often bring up Jordan, Pippen, and Rodman, but they often overlook Harper, who was a solid on-ball defender, was a large defender by point guard standards, and was often among the league leaders in steals per game. He put up modest numbers in his 23 minutes per game, but his defensive impact and his veteran presence went well beyond the stat sheet. Starting at the 2 was none other than the guy that most people recognize as the greatest player to ever live, Michael Jeffrey Jordan. He was 32 years old and at the height of his powers in terms of basketball IQ. He fiercely led his team while putting up numbers of 30.4 points, 6.6 rebounds, 4.3 assists, and 2.2 steals on 49.5% shooting. He also shot a lethal 42.7% from three-point range this season. The three-point line was a slightly shorter distance at this time, but even with that being said, Jordan's three-point efficiency was good enough to rank him in the top 10 of the entire league. This overall performance resulted in Jordan being named the league's MVP for a 4th time, and he was also a monster defensively, making first-team All-Defense. Starting as small forward was the tenacious 6'7" Scottie Pippen, who may have had his greatest season on the defensive end, as he not only made first-team All-Defense, but also finished second overall in the Defensive Player of the Year voting, only behind Gary Payton. Along with that, he put up his typical solid co-star production of 19.4 points, 6.4 rebounds, 5.9 assists, and 1.7 steals on 46.3% shooting. At the 4 spot was of course Dennis Rodman, whose role certainly wasn't to score on the offensive end, but simply to defend and rebound. And in those combined aspects, there's arguably nobody better, as Dennis led the league in rebounds with 14.9 per game, nearly 3 rebounds higher than the closest competitor. He was also first-team All-Defense, as Rodman filled the void the Bulls had the previous season in terms of interior defense. That impact can't be understated, as Rodman was even assigned to guard the Magic's Shaquille O'Neal at times, a role he relatively did very well in. More on that later. Starting at center was the 7'2" Luke Longley, who had modest numbers in his 26 minutes per game and was certainly the weakest spot in their starting lineup, but he still fit in well within the triangle offense and provided much needed size in the interior. The first men to come off the bench were a pair of elite shooters in Tony Kukoc and Steve Kerr. Kukoc was very ahead of his time, as the 6'10" small forward had a solid handle of the basketball and was capable of playing like a guard despite his 6'10" frame. He put up quality contributions in his 26 minutes per game, and he also shot a solid 40.3% from three-point range. The skilled forward was rewarded for this performance with the league's 6th Man of the Year award. Steve Kerr was far from a statistical monster off the bench, but what he was asked to do, he did extremely well, as he was the pinnacle of efficient shooting, as he was 51.5% from three-point range and 92.9% from the free throw line. In terms of being a spot-up shooting role player, it really doesn't get much more efficient than that. Rounding out the rest of the roster were guys like Judd Bushler, Bill Winnington, Dickie Simpkins, and Randy Brown. With the Zen Master working as the puppeteer, the greatest player on a revenge mission, and with a deep roster and a system built to succeed, the Bulls were set to dominate the league on a level no one had seen before. You could see their intensity and purpose from the early goings, as they started the season with 41 wins and only 3 losses, which was the greatest 3-loss start of all time. They were absolutely suffocating on defense, bolstering the league's best defense to go along with their best offense. The Bulls starters of Jordan, Pippen, and Rodman made up 3 of the NBA's 5 first-team All-Defenders. Since the NBA has had at least 25 teams, the '96 Bulls are the only team to ever accomplish that. When you consider that fact and then throw in Harper on top of it, the Bulls likely had the greatest perimeter defense the league has ever seen. With the Bulls' talented pieces, they could play just about any style of basketball, as they were great in the fast break, they could slow it down and run things through the post while Pippen facilitates as the point forward, they could play a shooting small ball lineup with Kukoc acting as the center, and with their toughness and collective tenacity, they could play as physically as the game permitted. By the end of the regular season, they finished with a record-setting 72 wins, heading into the playoffs as possibly the strongest favorites to win the championship the league has ever seen. They started by sweeping the Miami Heat in 3 games, and then comfortably eliminated the New York Knicks in 5 games, which set them up for a rematch with the team that defeated them the year before, the Orlando Magic. This was a 60-win defending conference champion Magic team, led by their dynamic tandem of Shaquille O'Neal and Penny Hardaway. This is not the kind of team that's supposed to get swept out of the Eastern Conference Finals, but that's exactly what Jordan and the Bulls did, charging their way to the NBA Finals. Waiting in the championship series was the 64-win Seattle Supersonics, led by Gary Payton and Shawn Kemp. They were a strong, defensive-minded team that most years they would be considered as the favorites to win the championship, but not against these Bulls, who started off with a commanding 3-0 lead before eventually eliminating the Sonics in 6 games, securing their 4th championship, with Michael Jordan being named the Finals MVP. Looking at the results of this group over the 1996 season, we see that the Bulls finished with a record-setting 72-10 record. They statistically had the best defense and the best offense overall that season. Of the teams in the GOAT series so far, they're the only team that finished as the best in both offense and defense. They beat teams by an incredible average of 12.2 points per game, which is the 4th greatest margin of victory in NBA history, and only slightly behind the 72 Lakers of the GOAT teams so far. They cruised through the playoffs with a 15-3 record, and they had that season's MVP, who was Michael Jordan. In this series, the word greatest gets thrown around quite a bit, but with this team in particularly, you can't possibly overuse it. They had possibly the greatest player of all time, the greatest duo of all time, the greatest coach of all time, the greatest perimeter defense of all time, the greatest rebounder of all time, altogether making a pretty solid argument for the title of greatest NBA team of all time.
The 1986-87 Los Angeles Lakers, who many people consider as the strongest championship group of the Showtime Lakers era. The Lakers organization has an incredibly strong and rich history, with many greats represented by some of the greatest players of all time. Even with all those great teams considered, many people still recognize this 87 group as the greatest Laker team, or even the greatest basketball team of NBA history. No team greater represents the Lakers brand, culture, and identity than the Showtime Lakers, whose fast-paced and exciting style of play helped define an entire era of NBA basketball. Leading this group at the point guard position was none other than the incredibly dynamic Earvin "Magic" Johnson. The 6'9" point guard had the first of his 3 MVP seasons, as he was the engine that drove the Lakers' high-octane offense. With his sudden and pinpoint decision-making, all of his teammates had to be ready at all times for the easier scoring opportunities that Magic would provide for them. It was another remarkably productive year for Magic, as he averaged about 24 points, a league-leading 12.2 assists, 6.3 rebounds, and over 1.5 steals on 52.2% shooting. Simply put, it was one of the greatest dual-threat seasons the league has ever seen, as Magic wasn't just the NBA's leader in assists per game, but he was also top 10 in points per game, which is easily the highest anyone has ever ranked in scoring, while averaging at least 12 assists per game. His support in the backcourt was the underrated 6'3" shooting guard Byron Scott. Scott loved to be on the finishing end of Magic's fast break, and had a solid mid-range pull-up jumper. He didn't shoot a tremendous amount of threes, but when he did, he was one of the most efficient shooters in the entire league, as he hit 43.6% from that distance, which was the 4th best percentage in the entire league. His offensive impact should get more credit for his team's success, as he put up 17 points per game during the 86-87 regular season. Starting at small forward was the 6'9" star, big game James Worthy. James is one of the most overlooked greats of basketball history and was the perfect running mate for Magic Johnson. James loved to run the floor and score in transition, and was the most frequent beneficiary of Magic's no-look passes. That wasn't the only way he scored his points though. James was great with his back to the basket and in face-up situations with the opponent, as he had one of the quickest first steps the game has ever seen. His unique ability to find his way to the paint led him to have an elite field goal efficiency, especially at his position, as he shot 53.9% on the season. He was selected to be an All-Star for the 2nd straight season, and on the year, he averaged nearly 20 points and 6 rebounds. Starting at power forward was the young AC Green, who always played with hustle and heart, and who was a couple rebounds short of a double-double average in only 28 minutes per game. AC certainly wasn't one of the major stars on the Lakers roster, but his contribution shouldn't be downplayed, as he was solid defensively in the interior and he was very reliable at securing the boards. He's also the most dependable player of all time when it comes to availability, as AC is easily the all-time record holder for consecutive games played and only missed 3 games throughout the entirety of his career. Then of course, starting at center was the captain, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. At 39 years old, Kareem certainly wasn't anywhere near his prime anymore, but his age didn't stop him from being one of the better centers of the NBA, as he poured in his 17.5 points per game and 6.7 rebounds on his typical incredibly efficient field goal percentage. Despite his age, Kareem was still very capable of finishing in the fast break, but the majority of his production came in half-court sets with his iconic skyhook shot, which, coming from the 7'2" Kareem, is probably the most indefensible shot the game has ever seen. Accompanied with their all-time great starting 5 was a powerful bench, especially concerning the first 3 players of the second unit. First off is Michael Cooper. Cooper is probably the greatest perimeter defender that no one talks about. He was incredibly tenacious with his on-ball defense and was usually the player who was assigned to contain the opponent's best perimeter score. For his career, Cooper made an astonishing 8 all-defense teams, and his 1987 campaign was even better, as he was that season's Defensive Player of the Year. He was one of the original 3-and-D type of players, as he shot 38.5% from three-point range on 2.8 three-point attempts per game, which, believe it or not, was actually a lot of attempts in the 80s, and he attempted the second most three-point shots that season among all NBA players. Midway through the season, the Lakers acquired Michael Thompson in a trade. He was a 6'10" center/power forward who was a finesse type of player. He was a solid scoring threat in his days before Los Angeles, averaging as many as 20 points per game. But with this all-time great Lakers squad, he would simply need to be a spark off the bench, and that's exactly what the 32-year-old did, as he chipped in with over 11 points and 5 rebounds on only 23 minutes per game. Also in the heart of the rotation was the 6'8" Kurt Rambis, who didn't have a pretty style of play, but he was another one of those players who did the little things well. He would fight for loose balls, help defend the Celtics bigs, and was always a sure thing to give 100% effort. This powerful roster of incredible individual players was a team that seemed tailor-made for Magic Johnson's skill set, as every member of the roster, including Kareem, was excellent at running the floor and pushing the tempo. I know I've alluded to this several times so far in this video, but I can't emphasize enough how uniquely fast this group was, as they treated every gained possession like it was the start of a track meet. Sometimes it almost seemed like they were completely forcing a fast break tempo, but even then, they still found ways to make it work. If they had to slow things down, they could, as Magic sometimes orchestrated the offense like a quarterback from the top of the key, and there's not many players who are better scoring options in the post than Kareem and James Worthy. Under Pat Riley's strong leadership and insatiable desire to win, this Lakers team had the league's best 65-17 record throughout the regular season. In the playoffs, no one was a challenge for them throughout the Western Conference, as they swept the Denver Nuggets in 3 games, defeated the Golden State Warriors in 5 games, and then swept the Seattle Supersonics out of the Western Conference Finals. Waiting for them in the NBA Finals was their rival and true challengers, the Boston Celtics. This was simply Los Angeles' time though, as they controlled the pace of the series and imposed their will upon Boston, defeating them in 6 games. To go along with Magic's iconic game-winning baby skyhook in Game 4, he also put up an incredibly monstrous stat line, nearly achieving the first triple-double average in NBA Finals history. It was a series performance that was so impressive that by the end of it, even Larry Bird was conceding that Magic Johnson had become the best player in the NBA. Looking at the results of this group over the 1987 season, we see that the Lakers finished with a league-best 65-17 record. They statistically had the league's best offense and the 7th best defense overall that season. They beat teams by a strong average of 9.3 points over the course of the season, and they coasted through the playoffs with a 15-3 record, represented by that season's MVP and Finals MVP, Magic Johnson. There's many GOAT-worthy teams of NBA history, but in a 7-game playoff series, this team may very well be the best of the best. As far as how they would match up against the other all-time great teams, well, I think the key would be for them to control the game's tempo, and if they were able to do that, then there's a decent chance that no one would beat them in a 7-game series, as a high-scoring and free-flowing style plays too much into the hands of this team. The key would be to get them to play in a physical half-court game, which is something the 96 Bulls or 89 Pistons may have been able to do successfully in a hypothetical matchup.
The 2013-14 San Antonio Spurs, the 5th and final championship team of the San Antonio dynasty. This team is famously remembered for their unselfish style of basketball, and for quite simply, some of the most beautiful team basketball we've ever seen. Veteran leadership certainly wasn't something the San Antonio group was lacking, as they had one of the oldest teams in the league, which was jam-packed with championship experience. Leading this squad was one of the greatest basketball coaches of all time, Greg Popovich, who instilled his fighting spirit into this squad. Under the leadership of Popovich, the Spurs played some of the most intelligent basketball I've ever seen. And one of the examples is how they used their spacing and ball movement to completely master the corner 3-point shot, which naturally is the most efficient shot in all of basketball. That season, San Antonio was easily the best 3-point shooting team in the league, as they hit a remarkable 39.7% from that distance. Along with that, the Spurs also led all teams that season in assists per game, with an average of 25.2. Running the floor for this group at the point guard position was the 31-year-old former Finals MVP Tony Parker. Tony operated as the floor general with his sound decision making and his high basketball IQ. Not only did he put up solid numbers throughout the season, but among starting point guards league-wide, Tony had one of the lowest turnovers per game averages in the entire league. Parker is also an underappreciated defensive guard, as he actually finished with some Defensive Player of the Year votes this season. Joining him in the starting backcourt was the 6'6" shooting guard Danny Green. At this point in history, Green was one of the best 3-and-D options in the entire league, as he had just recently broke 3-point records in the NBA Finals, and he was an underrated defensive player. Green was fantastic at making the game easier for his teammates, as he was terrific at moving without the basketball, and when his teammates found him open, he was about as sure of a thing as it gets, as he converted 41.5% of his 3-point attempts that season. Starting at the small forward spot was the young and upcoming star Kawhi Leonard. Although Kawhi hadn't quite reached his superstar levels of production, he was still everything the team needed him to be, as he was an absolute pest of a lockdown defender while efficiently chipping in from the field and from 3-point range.
With a game of basketball being dominated by athletic wing players, a young Kawhi Leonard was the perfect counter for San Antonio, as they used him as their defensive stopper for the Kevin Durant's and LeBron Jameses of the world. By far, their weakest link in the starting unit was the big man Tiago Splitter. With that being said, the 6'11 Splitter still knew how to operate in this team-first engine, as he was actually quite solid as a passer and sufficed decently as a rebounder. It is worth mentioning that although Splitter was a frequent starter, he also only averaged 21 minutes per game, mostly due to San Antonio's solid rotations with their 6th, 7th, and 8th man. More on those guys in a bit. Starting at the center position was the all-time great Tim Duncan. Although he was no longer in his prime, the big fundamental was still very effective at this point in his career, as he was second on the team in scoring while leading the Spurs in both rebounds and blocks. Duncan served as San Antonio's lead-by-example player, as his defensive presence around the rim was constantly felt, even at this later stage in his career. Obviously, you can't talk about the Spurs dynasty without bringing up one of the greatest sixth men in the history of the game, Manu Ginobili. Ginobili was a stabilizing force for the Spurs' second unit, as he was always quick to provide an offensive spark off the bench. He was a multifaceted talent who could finish around the rim, he was a solid three-point option, and he was one of the more underrated passers during that era. Marco Bellinelli and Patty Mills were not far behind Manu off the bench, and despite being role players with limited minutes, these two guys were some of the best shooters on the team, as they were both hitting north of 40% from three-point range. This well-rounded and experienced team finished the regular season with a 62-20 record. The Spurs started off the playoffs by being surprised by an overachieving Mavericks team, who pushed the first round to 7 games, but after that, San Antonio was locked in, both offensively and defensively. In the second round, they comfortably eliminated a talented Trailblazers team in only 5 games. And in the Western Conference Finals against the 59-win Oklahoma City Thunder, they eliminated Kevin Durant, Russell Westbrook, and the rest of that strong team in just 6 games. The NBA Finals were a rematch with a team that beat them the previous season, the Big Three Miami Heat. The thing is, San Antonio had matured and had significantly improved their chemistry. In the finals, the Spurs dominated the Heat like they were up against a D-League team, as they had an average margin of victory of a whopping 14 points per game, which is one of the largest averages in NBA Finals history. At times, the ball movement the Spurs displayed looked like the Harlem Globetrotters toying with the Washington Generals, as they went on to win the series easily in 5 games, and Kawhi Leonard was rewarded the Finals MVP. Looking at the results of this group over the 2014 season, we see that the Spurs finished with a 62-20 record, which was the best record in the NBA. They statistically had the 7th best offense and the 3rd best defense throughout the regular season. They had the best margin of victory that season, as they beat teams by an average of 7.7 points per game on the year. They cruised to an NBA championship, finishing that playoff season with a 16-7 record, although they did not have that season's league MVP, who was Kevin Durant. A lot of different teams have put forth a strong case for the title of the greatest team of all time, but probably none of them did it as unselfishly as the Spurs did in 2014, as they demonstrated beautifully what peak team-first basketball looks like. Given their defensive identity, their well-rounded offensive attack, and their emphasis on effective three-point shooting, I don't see this team struggling to compete with any all-time great team in a 7-game series, regardless of era. So what do you guys think? Which basketball team is the greatest team in NBA history? I look forward to hearing your conclusion in the comment section below. Thanks for watching as always, make sure to like and subscribe for more basketball content, and I'll see you guys in the next video.